On investment. So next, to discuss the current state of crypto and blockchain investment landscapes, including regulation, adoption, and what the future may look like in terms of investing in ecosystems, we are joined by an expert crew on this one. First on the panel, she is an experienced entrepreneur with 2 exits, involved in blockchain startups since 2013. She was co-founder and CSO of crypto and blockchain ecosystems Shaozun in China. She now consults in the space and is currently building Findy Ventures to invest into killer upcoming blockchain, crypto, Web3, and fintech startups. Please welcome Zia Word. Also, next on the panel, he is a co-founder and managing partner of Fabric Ventures, a VC fund adopting the early technical and patient approach of venture capital to investing in Web 3.0 and decentralized data networks. Fabric invested in projects such as Polkadot, Ocean Protocol, Orchid, Blockstack, and several others. This guest combines a pedigree of open source development-oriented tools and early-stage venture investing with blockchain focus since 2013. He has an investment. He invested in Pantera Venture Fund, Bitstamp, Bitrise, and several others. Please welcome Richard Muirhead. Next.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. Next guest on the panel is part of the PwC crypto team focusing on global crypto initiatives and co-founder of DoublePeak Investments, a family office in Hong Kong specializing in digital assets. At PwC, he works with the world's leading crypto exchanges, crypto funds, token issuers, and a broad range of clients from regulators to financial institutions. Please give a warm welcome to Galen Lakun.
Hey guys.
Welcome. Rounding off the panel, the head of Asia at Block Tower Capital, contributing to the firm's investment strategy and investments. Prior to this, he was with Goldman Sachs. Block Tower has invested in Origin Protocol, Creed, Hedera, Hashgraph, and many others, and operates a $140 million fund. Please welcome Steve Lee. Welcome, Steve. Last but not least is our moderator of the panel. She is a senior associate in the lending financial markets team at King & Wood Mallesons, specializing in blockchain technology, fintech, payments. She works on a broad range of clients, including startups, industry bodies, ASX 200 companies, government bodies, advising them on legal and regulatory issues associated with the implementation of applications on the blockchain, cryptographic assets, and digital currencies. She has been named the up-and-comer lawyer both in 2019 and 2020 Chambers and Partners FinTech Guide. She is also a fellow of Blockchain Australia and a member of Wall Street Blockchain Alliance. Please welcome our moderator, Hannah Glass. Hannah, the panel is yours, and welcome everybody.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to what I really hope is going to be an amazing panel. We have a lineup of true experts in the blockchain investment space here, and whilst I am not in the investing space, I have been in the blockchain area for a while. Thank you for that kind introduction. I am, yes, for my sins, I'm a lawyer at King & Wood Mallesons, but I have spent, at the very least, the past 6-7 years of my life immersed in this blockchain environment, as have this incredible panel. So what I'd like them to do is, whilst we've heard a little bit about their backgrounds, I'd like to invite each of the panelists to speak a little bit about themselves and what they're seeing at the moment, because I think it is undoubtedly quite a strange time that we're living in. So Remington, why don't you kick us off?
Sure, thank you, Hannah. By the way, I'm Remington. I'm one of the founding partners at Fenbushi Capital. Just to be clear, I'm not Steve. And Fenbushi Capital is the first venture capital fund out of Asia that's been focused on blockchain. We're founded in 2015. Since then, we've invested in about 120 projects globally. We are a global fund, so about half of our investments are in the US, a quarter in Europe, a quarter in Southeast Asia, China, and so forth. In terms of what we're seeing at the moment, I mean, this is obviously, we're in unprecedented times at the moment. And I think that's right now we are at a pivotal moment for the blockchain industry as well, especially what we've seen in a number of our projects who are working in particular with enterprise clients and even with some sort of consumer projects as well, trying to position themselves as essentially what is an essential business at this time. I mean, when you're looking at some of the problems that are plaguing sort of different countries' management of the pandemic right now, managing supply chains across with ventilators and PPE and things like that, or even having access to small business loans during this financial crisis, what we're seeing is some of our portfolio actually being able to step up and show what the value of leveraging blockchain and DLT to address some of these issues that supply chains and corporations are facing at the moment. So this is actually a very interesting time and very pivotal time for the industry to shine.
Wow, that's actually a really interesting point, because of course, blockchain is probably being much more of a new technology and not necessarily having the same legacy issues, is an alternative to the way that we structure society, and we are now having to reconsider how things are structured. But why don't we go to Galen? Can you please give us have a bit of a discussion about what you're seeing, particularly as Hong Kong is, of course, starting to emerge from this, whereas elsewhere around the world, we are still in the midst of full-blown lockdown.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. So just to give a brief overview, so I work at the PwC crypto team. I work very closely with the core team, Henry Arcelanian, our global PwC crypto leader. We work with a lot of crypto clients, including the world's leading crypto exchanges, crypto funds, token issuers. I focus a lot on the crypto strategy. Over in the last 2-3 years, we've worked over 320 different crypto engagements globally. So we're actually doing a lot of work in the crypto space. We also do a lot of thought leadership pieces. Our most recent report, the crypto M&A report that we published a few weeks ago, we did a lot of on-the-ground research to investigate, okay, what are the trends and the institutionalization of crypto funds or crypto investors investing into other types of digital asset companies. What I've seen in the past year or so since I joined PwC crypto team is that I've seen a lot of the rapid institutionalization of the crypto industry. I just remember the heydays of 2017 where you just put let's say $100,000, then you can make a 10 or 100x in a span of a few weeks, and those are the crazy days. But we've gradually seen that a lot of these players have died out slowly given the bear market we've seen in the last year or so. We've also seen a large increase of crypto custodians. We've also started seeing Fidelity with their SOC Type 1, Type 2 report, which is trying to give the institutional grade custody that a lot of crypto institutional investors are seeking.
Thank you. Yeah, I think custody is actually a really interesting point. And looking at movement in markets too, I think we're certainly seeing that there's a lot of fluctuation going. We'll come back to that point. But before we do, Richard, of course, being in London, things are certainly at a crossroads, you might say, in how the world is going over there.
Yeah, sure. It's certainly unprecedented for everybody over here, as it is, I think, for half the world's population, or at least half the world's GDP. And I mean, I think I'm just not going to repeat too much of what has been said already about some of the interesting applications and what's going on, but maybe it is interesting to highlight where we're seeing some of our portfolio and some of the pipeline. Think hard about how this sort of set of technologies we talk of as blockchain can be applied to some of the the crisis challenges. So certainly we see quite a few people building apps that are more prevalent from governments actually in Asia. So contact, track and tracing capabilities, where you've probably seen some of the announcements of the collaboration between Google and Apple. But also there are people looking to design things at the protocol level that allow you to retain the decentralized nature and self-sovereign management of your identity, and also to enact the tracing of your proximity to other individuals in a way that preserves your privacy on an ongoing basis. And so I don't want to steal thunder from some of those applications, but I see people coming from the kind of nutritional tracking direction to try and look at that, people to be tracking with apps an individual's consumption of nutrition on an ongoing basis. And also people coming from the direction of the kind of IoT and shared resources on a decentralized basis, and then meeting in the middle around this very acute pain point, which ultimately I think is, this is the way in which things get adoption. The other way that, you might be able to address people's needs currently, and in a way that is not profiteering from the kind of war that we're fighting, but perhaps indeed deeply beneficial, is in the whole kind of alternate reality world around gaming. Think kind of building value into non-fungible tokens, sort of baseball card style non-fungible tokens, and I'm seeing an incredible amount of activity around augmented reality, which we know is a strong direction for Apple, but not just from the technology side of the world, but also from the or even just the blockchain world, but from the very artistic side of the world. People really thinking hard about how this is going to create a whole new frontier of art and entertainment that is going to be valued extremely greatly by individuals. So I think we may see some acceleration in that space. And the thing that kind of colors our view and my view of this is kind of my third major macroeconomic crisis. Again, we can come back to it, but this is, we're in the foothills of a cascade of crises in this situation, I would say. And I'm not sure, I don't want to be alarmist, but I would say that it's hard to overstate, I think, the probable repercussions of the place we currently sit in right now. And I think that more than ever speaks to the necessity that entrepreneurs in the space, in the Web3 space broadly, have to be extremely pragmatic about the way they think about product development, that they need to think about problems and adopt the components of Web3. I can list 5 to 10 key components technologically of Web3, and seek to deliver minimal viable Web3, and not get religious about some kind of esoteric philosophical shift to decentralization or to new forms of money. So that would be my thoughts for the moment, but thanks, Hannah.
No, there's a lot in there. We'll definitely come back to those in a second, but I just want to give Zia a chance to introduce herself and talk about what they're doing, because I think as a fund, Findy has a slightly different take on the sorts of projects they like to invest in. So Zia, I think you're back now. Zia, I think you may be on mute.
Yeah. I'm not muted. Can you hear me?
All good. Yes.
Okay, great. So we are Findy Ventures. We basically come at investing from a consulting point of view. So we spend time with the companies that we invest in up to a month at a time, really digging in and helping pre-seed really early stage companies into getting to a stage where they can go to market. So that's where we come from. My background, I had a startup over in China for a few years, and I exited that company in 2018. So for a couple of years, I was strictly consulting, and now we're building our fund to focus entirely on blockchain, DeFi, Web3. And so, yeah, we spend time with companies that we invest in, and so we invest in a very few companies a year, rather than we don't look at sort of say the hundreds of companies that someone like Richard or Remington look at. We only look at a few companies, but we act as almost a funnel of deal flow for those investors at a later stage.
Thanks. Yeah, it's actually really interesting looking at this space, because we find that the people who were small startups even a year or 2 years ago are becoming big players. It's very much a fast-moving era, and I think we're currently even in an even faster moving part of the world, because things which in the traditional world would take 10 years are now happening in 2 weeks because they have to respond to the changes that are going on in the world. One of the interesting things, which a couple of you have just mentioned, is sort of this whole idea of dual use and repurposing some of the technologies that people have been focusing on. Richard, you mentioned that you're seeing people look at this from a movement tracking perspective. How does blockchain play into that? Because as far as I'm aware, a lot of the government apps are being produced by these big players, and there are actually privacy concerns.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, there are privacy concerns, whether it's provided by the Singapore government or whether it's provided by even a consortium of Google and Apple that are determined to make it private. And I encourage people to look up some of the designs that they've shared. But you know, there's always this question of, you know, at what point might be you become the product from an advertising perspective, or you become the persecuted from a state surveillance perspective. And so there is a concern. So there is this obviously concept within the context of Web3 of being able to define your identity on a decentralized basis, for it to be native to the network itself, and not, you know, to rely, it is true, on the network and on the maths and cryptography within the network, but not to have to rely, so be that Ethereum or to some degree Bitcoin, but more a kind of more generalized smart contract platform, so that you can define identity, and around that you can then build a function, you know, rich decentralized application functionality, you know, using the smart contracts and so on. And so Ethereum, I think, obviously has gone a long direction down this road. We actually are backers of Near Protocol, which is also building you know, a fundamental layer one technology incorporating decentralized identity, and we're also investors in Polkadot. So so we'll be long each of those three different projects, and we think there's room for quite a few fundamental blockchain technologies, incorporating identity, and then the ability to build applications on top of them. And then in the context of the tracking and tracing, you know, if you have it be the case that two individuals have an identity that is known to the network, but not to each other and not to any other trusted third party, and that, you know, an app that they're using that might be not just resident on their device, on their smartphone, for example, or their watch, but actually be quite deeply integrated with the device. So people have probably seen HTC's work on a blockchain phone, probably Samsung's work on in the S10 and beyond, into building, you know, hardware and software wallet capabilities and identity through biometrics into the phones, which raises in itself a whole bunch of questions about, you know, different parts of the supply chain or the devices you might want to trust. But it is possible then for there to be very precise information shared about not just your proximity with other individuals, but the duration of that proximity, which is really quite tough, and, you know, might require use of low energy Bluetooth, as well as Wi-Fi, as well as cell tower triangulation and so forth. So so it gets pretty sensitive, and so we, again, I think the announcements are still to come, but we see people seeking to, they've been thinking about these kind of questions and how that might allow for the delivery of services that people value. But obviously this gives a very specific use case for them to focus around, and they're really sharpening the kind of deployment of their kind of their platforms and the protocols they're delivering to address this problem of trying to, you know, very quickly work out who else you might have been close to that needs to be traced, specifically just for the purpose of you know, stemming an epidemic and before it becomes a pandemic.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you're saying there is ultimately we're trying to make sure that we use everything that we have at our disposal to actually manage this situation. And it does require a degree of collaboration between, whether it's different players, different technologies, different people, both on a national and international scale.
Well, we had just to sort of, if I can chime in, you had one of it, you know, kind of in the preparation we were thinking about this, and you could argue the last crisis helped produce Bitcoin. It really sharpens people's attention on particular, you know, use cases. That was a financial crisis. This is a health crisis. And we all can see the benefit in the long term of moving to a position of continuous health, continuous data monitoring. However, it is also the case that people turn to their rulers, however authoritarian they might be, and whether they're corporate or or whether they're actually states in times of crisis, and willingly give up a lot of freedom. I think there's an interesting book called kind of Escape from Freedom or something, I think it's called, about the general tendency that populations can have. And they willingly give up their freedom, which they then learn to regret down the line. So we somehow have to think carefully about that and find that balance between moving to this better world of continuous health, but also not giving up our freedom.
Yeah, I think the word balance is right there. It's a matter of doing what we need to do in the interim to actually get through to the other side, but it's also making sure that when we emerge at the other side, the new normal isn't such that, okay, now your entire movement is tracked 24/7.
Exactly.
Which is definitely something which I know with self-sovereign identity and blockchain-based systems have certainly been looking at. Remington, you work a lot with people in sort of the enterprise space. What are they doing? What are you seeing in terms of focusing on this trend?
So I think, first of all, some of the things that Richard mentioned in terms of people tracking, obviously, I think contact tracing is sort of one of the big points that are being tackled right now, and even here in China by the likes of Alibaba and Tencent. And one of the interesting things, I mean, Richard mentioned sort of the design some of these companies and solutions are thinking of in terms of using your Bluetooth IDs, having it be pseudonymous, having it such that even sort of a centralized server, even Apple and Google couldn't necessarily be able to identify sort of who the person is, that sort of each of these is locally stored. I think that the interesting thing is that obviously, a lot of this is evolving very fast, and as they sort of tackle these questions, a lot of these lessons that they're learning can also be applied to how we design decentralized apps and how we design sort of zero-knowledge protocols and things like that in our industry as well. The other thing, I think, more to your question around enterprise, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of concern right now around, in particular, one of the concerns is around supply chain, around sort of the veracity of PPE and medical equipment that are being shipped globally, how to sort of track where it is, how to manage the supply chain financing as you're sort of trying to move containers around to shift the supply chain across many nodes in a very short amount of time. Sort of people are running into problems, and blockchain companies are stepping up and saying that, hey, you know what, some of these problems you're facing, we can actually already solve that in our ready to use products already. And the second part around that is there's been a lot of debate ongoing in the US around sort of the stimulus checks and how it's getting to people. And actually in one of the presentations earlier, Da Hongfei also mentioned that it was just yesterday, the DCEP, the Chinese central bank digital currency application, one of the screenshots was just leaked into the public, and sort of people are saying that it's already beginning trial phase in May in sort of one of the tier 2 cities in China on a small scale. And sort of one of the first use cases that has been identified is how to sort of give, I think it was transportation reimbursements to essential personnel in one of the cities. And this actually relates very directly to some of the issues that the US and other countries are trying to face in addressing sort of how to send stimulus checks to people. Is CBDC, a central bank digital currency, a right solution for this? We don't know yet, but it's actually one of the issues that's actually very, very timely right now.
It's interesting that you raise CBDCs, because one of the other things that kind of happened, or that we've seen in this crisis, is a renewed focus on alternative mechanisms of payment. Indeed, particularly in Australia over here, people aren't actually accepting cash anymore. because there is a concern that that will actually transmit the virus. But one of the interesting points, and you spoke about the US, in the bill to actually introduce their stimulus package, there was a draft which was released, which actually mentioned a US form of digital currency. Now, I know that's obviously didn't get put into the final bill, didn't get passed, but it shows that that's clearly something which we're looking at. Galen, what are your views on this?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's two prevailing thoughts to this. One is, let's say, private enterprise. You've seen Facebook Libra. We actually need to thank Facebook Libra because basically they've spurred a lot of action from regulators around the world in terms of applying these blockchain type technologies and regulating these aspects. We've also seen a spur of government entities in terms of investigating into central bank digital currencies. I guess, currently there's two prevailing thoughts. One is the private enterprise. We've seen enterprises such as Facebook coming out with their own token Libra, or let's say, government CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. I guess, one of the biggest concerns of, let's say, using Facebook Libra is, the privacy issue, which Richard and Remington has highlighted earlier on just now. We've also seen in early 1800s or 1900s is basically in the US, they had these huge corporations and they used something called script. And they gave these coal miners or these workers company dollar bills to be used in these cities, in these towns. And, you can only use these company bills to pay for certain items. And by having so much control over, let's say, individual, you need to think about, okay, what is the best interest for the people, right? Which central bank digital currencies comes in, backed by the government. Will the government have, a better idea in terms of managing the interests of the people versus, let's say, private enterprises trying to control, having this currency, being able to see so much information that can be monetized for, let's say, advertising purposes. I think central bank digital currencies, it's a game changer. I mean, governments can really tweak their fiscal monetary policies real time. They're able to see how the economy is doing. The way you measure GDP today is, you lick a finger, put it in the air and say, oh, this is the GDP today. But in actual fact, the GDP data is already outdated. By having a central bank digital currency, you'll have full transparency on what the economy is doing right now, every single second, real-time data. And, this is something that's really powerful, being able to see where the money is currently being used at, or, to tackle corruption, which is a huge challenge in China right now. We've also seen, capital controls. And I think, this certain area, especially with the introduction of central bank digital currencies, especially from China, I think I'm very bullish to see many more different countries, such as Marshall Islands, coming out with their own sovereign digital currency.
Yeah, central bank digital currencies are certainly a game changer, but what's fascinating is that the discussion around central bank digital currencies didn't just start in 2019. It actually has been around for quite a while. There are projects between Singapore and in the UK too, which they looked into but didn't seem to go anywhere. So we are definitely seeing this resurgence. But one of the other things that it's coupled with in terms of a resurgence is alternative forms of capital and financing. And Zia, you actually mentioned the world of decentralized finance and DeFi. Do you think that's another trend we're going to see a bit more as we kind of move into this more digital new age? Zia?
You cut out at the end there.
Sorry. I just wanted to ask, where do you think we're going to go? And do you think that DeFi is another trend we're going to see emerging even more so?
Due to the crisis?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think, it's an ideal environment for DeFi to kind of come to the fore. I think we're already seeing a little bit of an emergence in the last sort of 6 months. And I think that the problems that we have with DeFi are probably, we're not quite there with it yet. So I do think we'll see an emergence, but the problems we have with DeFi are still there. So I think that we need to sort of fix those before we see a real adoption. And I think that will probably be another sort of 6 months down the line. So I do think we'll start to see a resurgence of usage of DeFi, but I do think it's another 6 months off.
What would you say are the real problems, or what are you seeing as the problems in this space?
I think there's a lack of trust and a lack of regulation, but I also think there's a real problem, and I think it's probably related to the industry as a whole, that we have there's a real branding problem in the industry in terms of how we communicate what the industry does to the wider public. And that's something that I think we need to solve as an industry, as a sort of wider issue. So, people that we talk about mass adoption all the time, but we're not going to get there until we solve the kind of PR problem that we've got. So I think there's that, and I think that we also have a few infrastructure problems in terms of how stable those kind of DeFi technologies are.
Can I chime in, Hannah?
Go for it.
Yeah. So we see actually the evolution of this core use case of Bitcoin as a store of value and version of kind of digital gold, through to the development now of the DeFi ecosystem as on Ethereum as kind of not even the end in itself, but actually that is the kind of weaponization of this wave of software to disrupt all sorts of other different sectors. And so that's kind of an underpinning of how we think about our investment thesis. And what I mean by that, I already mentioned non-fungible tokens in the context of entertainment. You can talk about invoice factoring in the context of a supply chain. We have an investment in Centrifuge that is addressing that, for example. But to focus a little bit on the DeFi side of things, we're excited about the use now of Bitcoin as a store of value, bridging across to the Ethereum ecosystem. For example, again, I don't want to plug too much, but TBTC, which is something that's been brought to the market by Keep, one of our investments. And so that allows you to use your Bitcoin as collateral to unlock stable coins in the form of DAI. And I think on an ongoing basis, you can see that actually, despite some of the stress tests have been pretty extreme for the stablecoin DAI that they've been put under in terms of the volatility and the underpinning collateral, that actually it's managed to kind of weather that storm pretty strongly. Even though there are some, actually even pending kind of lawsuits going on. But I believe a kind of a Nietzschean approach is what the ecosystem is going through, and the things that don't absolutely kill it are literally just weeding out the next challenges that it has in terms of handling that kind of volatility. But it's really moving things forward. I think another interesting area is if you think of the pain that is involved for small businesses. And indeed for the banks, traditional banks, and for the governments in trying to get, in this case, in the UK's case, COVID resilience, packages out there to the right people and right businesses in the right time, it's extreme. And there's horrible numbers about the kind of very small single-digit percentages of the kind of applicants who are getting anywhere with these processes. And it was noted actually on on Sifted, part of the FT, for example, that just by one of the commentators, that why haven't we? It's the top, I think, 20 banks, including the major high street banks, that are being used to distribute these loans in the UK, but none of the fintech, the challenger bank, digital banks are being used for that process. Let alone, of course, thinking about how we might be able to, deliver a decentralized finance in a version of universal basic income, and be able to kind of get all the way through to individuals, understand their circumstances, and deliver to them some kind of Keynesian stimulus as is required at different parts of the macroeconomic cycle. I think there's a huge amount of potential in that, not least in just taking out the paperwork and the trust involved in people having to fill out loan applications. And then suddenly, I've been helping people do it, and suddenly they're having to talk to kind of bank managers again, which they haven't been doing for ages anyway, because the world hasn't operated that for a little while. So anyway, I think there's huge opportunity going forward, and we're scratching the surface.
No, certainly. It's definitely a new world order. I know in Australia we've found it really interesting that a lot of the requirements still need you to sign paper with a pen. And so people are actually able to access some of the stimulus, but they can't because they need a piece of paper and a pen, and they need to give that to someone, and you're not allowed to leave your house. So there are some practical issues in kind of the current scenario that haven't really been thought through in the digital space. And when you're moving into a digital native solution, that really does change the way that things operate. Galen, you were saying a little bit about sort of investment in tokens and coins and crypto. Do you think that that's something else that is happening a bit more? And where do you see this influencing it? I know you also mentioned M&A in this area too.
Yeah, so basically, according to our latest research, right, the majority of the crypto M&A and fundraising actually took place outside of the US. Actually, most of the APAC activity, as well as the emerging EMEA, has seen the increased activity. We've basically seen a huge shift from, let's say, the US-based startups, fundraising to, let's say, the Asian market, where actually a lot of China or even Asian-based investors are really attracted in terms of these new and novel investments. Simply because there's so much more capital out here, and being able to see and unlocking new deal flow and opportunities, especially with Asia. I guess initially at a very early stage, the reason why we haven't seen as much activities is because there's this huge language and cultural barrier. People are not familiar with the new technologies that are coming out. It's only up till now where people are much more familiar with this type of technology. Chinese investors are, I would say much more, who are, relatively more conservative, are seeing to start to see these crypto additional asset investments as much more of a conservative approach in terms of investing. We see that the current investment activity revolves around the equity side, less on tokens these days. I think a lot of people are scared of the tokens simply because they've lost a lot of money in 2017, 2018. I mean, we've seen a lot of different cryptocurrencies has dropped 80, 95, 99% from the peak in 2017. So we've seen a lot of activities in terms of the equity investments, in terms of the token investment. I do believe in terms of the APAC and EMEA region will play a bigger role in the coming future. And I believe that with more deal flow coming from out of the US, having more access to information, we'll see a lot of these growth in these certain areas in terms of fundraising.
Yeah. Zia, I noticed you were nodding your head a lot then. You've spent quite a bit of time in Asia and China in particular. Does that align with what you've been seeing? I think you may still be on mute.
Absolutely, our focus is entirely outside of North America. We don't focus on North America at all. We do look very much at emerging markets in Asia. I mean, China obviously is a big market in itself already. It's a completely different beast from many markets. But I look at we've even got Central Asia now that's kind of coming up. So we're talking about Turkey, and some of the stands are actually interesting markets to look at. So yeah, I think that the focus is definitely shifting away from sort of North America, and we see a little bit in Africa as well. That's kind of coming up, and I think they're a little bit behind, but we definitely see some activity happening there, and I think there is a stronger need in some of these cases as well for particular types of technologies that blockchain can facilitate. So last mile, things like that really, particularly last mile finance, really are very meaningful in a lot of areas outside of the West, really.
Yeah, that's right. When you're trying to deal with people who have never had a bank account, going through a traditional mechanism doesn't necessarily make sense when everyone has a smartphone, which is literally in their back pocket.
Yeah, absolutely. The penetration of smartphones is obviously, it's actually higher than the amount of people that have bank accounts. So that's, it makes a lot of sense in that regard.
Yeah, definitely. Now, we only have a couple of minutes left, but what I'd like to do is I want everyone to have a think about, we're going back to the 1st of January. What prediction did you get wrong? And Zia, let's start with you.
Well, first of all, I predicted it'd be a fantastic year. I don't know what happened there, but yeah. So I think
it'll still be a fantastic year.
Well, this is true. This is true. I mean, I do think there's a lot of opportunity in what's happening right now. There's a real, from a technology point of view, from a investing point of view, but also from a humanity point of view. So there is a lot that can be done, and I think that in our industry we're in a really good position to facilitate a lot of those needs. So that's great, and I think. That is something that I did predict. I did predict that Web3 is going to start to integrate more seamlessly into people's lives, which is the essence of Web3 essentially. And I think that the more that we get to that, the better. And I think that this is a terrible crisis, but I do think that we will potentially. Some good will come of it, and we'll have some adoption of technologies that can really help us deal with these kinds of things in the future. So that as prediction is probably, come true. And then I guess I'll open it up to the rest of the panel.
Yeah. I think, Richard, I did read something that you were also looking very much so, and of course it is part and parcel with the ethos at Web3 and where that's going to go. And this potentially could be the year of Web 3.0.
Certainly the year of, and in fact, the decade of Web3. And in no way am I talking up my book when I say that. No, I mean, what we were really focused on at the beginning of the year is this has been a kind of an overnight 10-year journey to build the best kind of venture platform we could come up with to support entrepreneurs. And with this sort of sharpened focus around Web3, we're sort of raising our second fund. There is this incredible habit in humans actually to, ironically, sort of accidentally buy high and sell low. Because people tend to get on the bandwagon late, they buy high and then they panic and then they sell. And I think there's possibly no other sector this is more the case than in the context of, should we say, Web3 and cryptocurrency and so forth. So, we'd seen that, and I'd kind of chortled with some other investors about how in the private market, we'd seen that play out repeatedly. So you kind of really have to have prices going up, and then suddenly you'll go, oh, well, maybe I should invest, instead of people saying, oh, the prices are down, now's the time to get on board and consolidate my position. And so, we've been tackling that with the private LPs coming into this market, and this is a very particular structure we have. It's a venture structure. It's patient, long-term money. It's not a hedge fund structure or let alone trading. And we were making good progress with this. But I was predicting that was really going to come to a head. And I was thinking that we're probably at the top of the macroeconomic cycle. And a big thing that we focus on is the opportunity, and particularly in venture, to make commitments that primarily are deployed in the bottom of a macroeconomic cycle. If you look across venture funds, the ones that do better than a 10x in terms of performance, which obviously is pretty incredible for a fund, tend to be the ones that are like 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12. I can name a number of ones that achieve that. And so we think it's very exciting from that perspective, and we thought that we'd get the private people over the line. Right now, two things have happened that I couldn't predict. Number one, because all of the private individuals have panicked in an extremely human way because of the current crisis. I get it. It's not necessarily rational at all, but but they often have a liquidity crunch themselves, obviously. But the other thing I couldn't predict is actually that state bodies, because of the opportunity to kind of stimulate the economy through investing through managers into small businesses, and the importance to be demonstrably kind of acting. Actually, state actors have been really positive about this space, and I think a lot of whether it be central bank digital currencies and spilling over into the concern about sustainability and ethicality of supply chains is really of interest to state sponsors. And I think in Europe, there's a big push to be not just seen as, but actually, be able to build on, GDPR around data protection into this third way that sits somewhere between sort of, surveillance capitalism on the one side and the surveillance state on the other, geopolitically, should we say. So I didn't predict how quickly that would come front and center.
Richard,
yeah.
thank you
Richard.
very, very
I think
much.
we may be at the final point. Thank you, everyone. We've had an absolutely incredible panel. I think it's safe to say that whilst we may be in an uncertain time, it is definitely a time for growth. And this will be the decade, potentially, of Web 3.0. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you guys.
Thank you,
Zia, Richard, Galen, Remington, and Hannah. Incredible moderation. Thank you to all of you guys. The insights were absolutely amazing. Very, very interesting. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Moving on, things are just action-packed. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed that. We have some very special guests coming up. They're lined up one after the other. We're going to go to a short break right now, and we'll be right back in a few moments.